We are live. Thank you for joining us today. Today is the 7th of April, 2016. And on this session, we're going to talk a little bit about setting up your recorder again. We've had a lot of questions about that, and I think they're really good questions. So I wanted to talk about that. Now, the secret, well, there are a few things to remember. There are no secrets here. It's actually quite straightforward. Every recorder is just a little bit different. Here we have our Tascam DR60D Mark II. I had some questions on that one, so we're going to spend a little time on that. Zoom F8 I've got here for today as well. That one's going to be harder to show because I've got it tethered to this massive battery. We'll talk about both of those, but the important thing to keep in mind is that pretty much all recorders operate with the same basic idea, and you just need to kind of figure out for your particular recorder how it handles things. So let's take a step back first and talk a little bit about what the end goal is when you're recording audio for film or video. So there are a couple different ways you can approach recording, and the kind of the way that it's typically done in nowadays in larger budget productions is that not only do they record the individual ISO tracks, and what I mean by ISO tracks is that for each microphone, they record that to a separate track. So you can actually edit it independent of all the other microphones when you get into post production and editing. But they also record a stereo track typically. And the stereo mix track, it's usually called, is a combination of all the microphones that you're recording. Now, in the past, in days that are pretty significantly in the past, all they actually recorded typically was a stereo mix in most cases. Because in those cases, if they had to record anything more than, say, for example, two microphones, they only had a left channel and a right channel. So they had to go ahead and do a mix. And if you still, to this day, most professional productions are still recording a stereo mix track for a variety of reasons. And I don't want to get too much into all of those. But first of all, you need to ask yourself the question, what do I need at the end? Do I just need isolated tracks for each of the individual microphones I'm recording? Or do I also need, in addition to that, some stereo tracks? So that's one thing to consider. Now, if you just need isolated tracks, that is great. You can do the mixing in post-production and figure out, the levels on each of them. Or, in a lot of cases, for example, when I'm shooting a corporate video, a lot of times if I have an interview that I'm doing, I will put a lavalier microphone on the talent. I will also boom a microphone. But in the end, as long as everything's good with that boom track, I'm going to use that and I'm going to completely drop and get rid of the lavalier track. If I'm doing a two-person interview, then I'll obviously need to keep both of them. And in that case, I may boom both of them and lav each of them separately as well. But again, I will typically default to the boom track if I have an option. And if that recording came out okay.
But in the end, as long as everything's good with that boom.
Okay. Sorry about that. I think we got that problem solved. I was getting feedback in my headphones here. But in the end, again, if everything's good, I will default to the boom mic. I'll only use the lavalier mics if I need them. So that is something to keep in mind. So you needed to make that determination. I guess I should go ahead and describe a little bit of the reasoning behind why you might want a stereo mix track in addition to your ISO tracks or isolated tracks. A lot of times on bigger productions, what they will use those for is that when the way things work is you're in production, you shoot. In post-productions, all of the assets, all of the video clips and the audio clips are delivered to the post teams. And the first team that does their work is the editors, typically. So the editors will get the film, and actually there can be dailies as well, but I'm not going to make it too complex here. In any case, the editors get it. They will sync the stereo track to all the clips, and then they will do their editing. They will cut up and slice up all the clips and put them together and create their cut. And then once they have the picture lock, as they call it, they have the edit the way they want it. Then they will send the files over to sound, and then the sound will either use the stereo tracks if they're good, Or in many cases, they'll actually swap out the stereo tracks and then put in the isolated tracks or the ISO tracks and actually kind of fine tune those and get those to the point where they want them. So that's one of the big reasons. Also, if you're on a production where you're doing dailies, the stereo track is usually what they use to sync with the dailies. So there are a lot of reasons to use the stereo tracks. Another kind of scenario is that if you're doing a production where the turnaround is very quick, a lot of times they will just take the stereo tracks and use those because they don't have a lot of time. They don't have time to wait for the editor to do everything, then pass it off to sound and sound to bring it back, then send it off to coloring, and then bring it back and take it from there. So yes, optimistic simplicity. I can read your message, so thanks for that. So that's kind of the background. So first of all, you need to determine what do you need. Do you need isolated tracks? Do you need a stereo track? If you don't need a stereo track, that's great. You can just go with the isolated tracks and do your mixing in post. So that'll also help you determine which kind of device you need. So if you need a device that can do mixing, then you're going to want to look at probably a more sophisticated set of devices, recorders and mixers, versus something a little bit more straightforward, again, like a Tascam DR60D Mark II, a little more straightforward. While technically this does have some mixing capabilities, it's pretty it's pretty simplistic. It's not super sophisticated, but it can be plenty for your production depending on what you're doing. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Let's now, with that as a background, let's go to some of the questions that I got this week, and I'm going to read a couple of these to you here. Let's see here. Gary Davies first asks, many filmmakers choose to record audio separate from their video. To help maintain synchronization in post-production, are there ideal settings a recorder should be set to? For example, is there a correlation between audio and video with the choice of bit rates? Also, what problems are caused when you record using the MP3 format? So those are both good questions. Number one, first of all, in regards to the audio and video bit rates, what I typically do is that you have to know, first of all, where is your production going in the end? Where are you going to deliver it? Where is it going to be viewed? If you're uploading to YouTube, YouTube will convert the sample rate. This is separate from the bit depth, and we'll come back to that in a minute. The sample rate that YouTube will display to people that come to see your videos is it will actually play the audio back at 44.1 kilohertz or 41,000 hertz. So if you're going to YouTube and you know that's your final destination and that's the only place you're going to shoot things, then you probably want to set your sample rate to 44.1 kilohertz. I got that wrong earlier. It's 44,100 kilohertz. But if there's any chance you're going to go to be screened in a theater, or you perhaps do independent film festivals and things of that nature, typically in those cases, the audio is going to be broadcast at 48 kilohertz. So you're probably going to want to actually record at 48 kilohertz in that case. Now, there's all sorts of arguments one could make about, should I actually record at a higher sample rate, like 96 kilohertz, and then in post-production, once I'm done with my editing, I can actually resample at 48 kilohertz or 44.1 kilohertz, depending on where I'm going. You can do that. I have never, and I think a lot of different people feel differently about that. My sense is that most people generally can't tell a big difference. So I usually just shoot at the sample rate that I'm going to produce at eventually. So that's one thing to consider. Second thing that I think is more important is your bit rate. And actually, I take that back, bit depth, which is sometimes called word length. Bit depth is typically, your options are typically 16-bit or 24-bit. And what this refers to is each individual sample, how many bits does it get to encode that? And really, I would say in most cases, if you have the option, I would go to 24-bit, because my sense is if you're going to do any post-processing, typically, and again, other people have different opinions about this. I think tends to be a little bit more consensus on this, but I would typically record at 24-bit, do my post-processing, And then when I'm ready to do the final export, it will go to a 16-bit format, or perhaps it'll even go to another format that has a different bit rate altogether, so or bit depth altogether. So that's one thing. Now, in regards to cameras and settings between the two, I used to think that actually there needed to be a correlation between the sample rate of the audio that you recorded on your camera and the sample rate of the audio that you record on your audio recorder. And I'm not finding that that makes any difference. So that's not something to be concerned about. If you're doing time code, that's different. And we're going to come back to that because that's a very big topic on its own. In that case, you do need to set your recorder up correctly to have the same frame rate that your camera has. So we will talk about that in another episode. But also, Gary, you also asked about MP3 format. I would highly recommend to stay away from MP3 format as a recording format if you can. MP3 is very much like on your recorder. When you record with a lossy, it's a lossy format. And that is to say, as you're recording, it's throwing information out that it doesn't think it needs. And you're just losing the ability to do any sort of post-processing without introducing a lot of artifacting. So I would actually stay away from MP3 in as much as possible for that reason. And because of that, I don't have a lot of experience recording with MP3 separate from my video. I think if you're going to go to the trouble of recording your audio separate from your video, there's no reason to use MP3 at all. You should definitely be going to WAV or broadcast WAV format, which are lossless formats. So there are a couple thoughts there. Art Johnson's next question. I have a handy Zoom one, I assume, yeah, Zoom H1, which is very basic and easy to use. I recently purchased an awesome Zoom H5, which has very detailed settings and sometimes confusing settings. I feel as if I need to retrain myself each time I want to use it well. Art, that's a fine point, and I think hopefully here today we can cover some things that'll make it a little easier for you. All right, so let's kind of step through the basics, and then I'm going to come back to some of these in just a minute here. I have actually here on the screen, and I'm going to show this to you so you can see it. There we go. Okay. So this is actually the manual for the Zoom F8. And again, don't freak out if you don't have the Zoom F8. These the same ideas apply to almost any recorder with XLR inputs and even recorders without XLR inputs, to be honest. So let's just take a look here. The first things that I like to set up, kind of the very basics. And let me see if I can find it here. I'm just going to do a search. Okay, setting the sample rate. Here we go. On the Zoom F8, as an example, you would press the menu button, you go into the record menu or rec menu, and then right in there you set your sample rate. And again, in most cases, I'm going to set it to 48 kilohertz, just like they have it set here. You have a variety of other options as well, but almost always I'm going to use 48 kilohertz. So these are kind of the standard sampling rates. It also gives you some information that may be helpful to you as well. And these are not going to apply as much on most of the productions we're working on, and it's probably more detailed than I want to get here. But that's how you would set it up. And that's one of kind of the key settings when you're setting up your recorder. So I would definitely go to sample rate of 48 kilohertz and call it good on that. Now, we also talked about bit depth, and that happens to be in the very same menu here. Again, I would set that to 24 on any recorder that's capable of doing that, including the Zoom H1. You have that option to set to 24-bit. Again, that's just going to give you a lot more room in post to do some editing and in the end get an artifact-free audio recording. So something to consider there. All right, let's talk about these other settings in the rec menu here. We already talked about bit depth. Again, MP3, I would stay away from that. If for whatever reason you have to do MP3, go for the highest bit rate, which in a lot of recorders is going to be 320 kbps. So that's something to consider. All right. I need to go back because I want to look at these other menus here. Record to SD1. Let's just do a search on that. Okay. This shows the settings here. So here's something to look at over here. So when you go into the rec menu, there's this other setting here on the Zoom F8. And actually, you'll see this on a lot of other recorders that have two separate cards, or you'll also see it on the recorders that only have a single memory card. There'll be a setting here to essentially asking you what it is, what do you want to record? How many tracks do you want to record and in what format? So, for example, on the Zoom F8, you actually have the ability to record separate things to two separate cards. That can be great. You can have a backup, which is really helpful. But let me just walk through the different options they have here. So, for example, we're over here now. If you wanted to record all of the ISO tracks, I would choose just the ISO tracks. I would choose this first option, which says track 1 through 8 polywave. What that would do in practical terms is that would record each of the 8 channels, or however many channels you happen to be recording. If you're not recording 8 channels, it would just add however many you do have, however many microphones you have set up, um, all in the same file, but recorded to separate channels. And then in post, you can actually break those apart and edit each of them separately. So that's one thing to do if you just want the isolated tracks, again, for each channel, which is equivalent to each microphone. Then if you also, in addition to that, let's see here. Track 1 through 8 mono stereo wave. This actually creates a separate file for each channel and also creates a stereo file at the end. So the stereo file is your stereo mix, and then it will also have separate files for each of the individual microphones you have set up. So that's your option right here, this second one, if we were looking up here at this area. Now, the next one is the exact same thing, except it's going to put all of the channels into one big file. So you'll have a separate channel for each individual microphone, plus you'll have two additional channels that will represent the right and the left of the stereo mix track. So that's another thing you can do there. And then let's see here, this last one, same thing, but again, it's going to break each channel into a separate file. So individual files. If you have any questions, if you're not sure on this, I would recommend, and you're not looking to get a stereo mix file as well, I would just go with this first option, track 1 through 8 polywave, and be done with it. If it really annoys you to have all of the channels in a single file and you'd rather have them broken out because you're going to edit them separately, then just go with this second option here, track 1 through 8 mono stereo wave. So I hope that clears that part of things up for you, because that can actually be a fairly confusing one when you're first doing it. Now let's take a break from that. I want to show you, again, many of you are using the Tascam recorders, and let me just show you on a Tascam DR60D Mark II. I'm going to have to do it myself first. If you were just recording a single channel, you go into, again, the rec menu. And I don't know if that's focusing right. But there is in the rec menu, or sorry, it's called rec mode. It's the very first menu. The rec mode, your options are mono, stereo, dual mono, and dual stereo. And then you can also do 4 channel. So if you are recording 2 microphones and you want to record each microphone to a separate channel, you say you're using the 2 XLR inputs, you're going to want to choose rec mode stereo. What that will do is it will actually put the channel 1 microphone on the left channel, and it will put the channel 2 microphone on the right channel. And then you can edit those separately in post. So that's one thing. If you're just recording one mic in, and say, for example, you want to do that in the first XLR input, what you would do is on rec mode, you would choose mono. Plain and simple as that. And then the source is just which individual input you want to use. So you can change that if you want. If for whatever reason you want to use channel 2 instead as your only input, you could just change that to channel 2. So it's that simple. Don't make it more complicated than that. Pretty straightforward. Also on the Tascam recorders, at least on the 60D Mark II, in terms of doing those other settings that we talked about before, you go to the rec setting menu. And there is where you can save the format, which in most cases, I would recommend the broadcast wave format, BWF, 24-bit. That's what I would choose. And then for the sample rate, I would choose 48 kilohertz under most circumstances. And that's all you have to do in terms of setting those settings up on the Tascam. All right. Let's see. Okay, now that we have that established, there was a couple of other questions. I want to jump back to some of those. Anna asked a couple of questions, Anna Corey. Curtis, what could be the reasons why when you're recording in your Tascam DR60D Mark II using your Rodelink wireless lavalier mic, you may get very low sound recording in return? There are lots of reasons for that, Anna. It's a good question. I don't know. What I don't know for sure here is if you're recording just with your recorder or if you were sending a feed to your camera. If you're sending your feed to your camera, there's some additional things we're going to have to talk about. But if it's just to your recorder, let's read on here and we'll talk about that first. Yesterday, I was shooting an interview and everything seemed right on in the display of my Tascam. I mean, it looked as if I was getting the right levels. I set the recording to mid gain and the gain on my transmitter was set to 0 and the same with the receiver. It was set to 0. I also had set my rec mode to mono. My limiter was also mono, low cut 80 hertz, and delay in ref. So those are all kind of the settings I recommend in my course, I believe. Format, broadcast wave format, 24-bit, sample rate 44.1 kilohertz. That's all great, and everything was set right on that front. The sound I was hearing on my headphones seemed right too, but when I was playing back the recording on my laptop, the sound was so low. At the end, I had to set the gain on the transmitter to, I think you wrote -20, but I think you probably meant +20. And it was like that I could get a good playback level on my recording file. What do you think I was doing wrong? It's so hard to tell on those things. I assume that you had adjusted, so you had set the gain to mid, and then you had adjusted the fader here so that you got to the point where the peaks were hitting -12 or so. Um, let me describe a little bit, and I think may have been a little bit unclear about this in the past. When you're recording and you set your gain and then you set your fader and you get it to the point where the peaks as the person is talking is hitting -12, that's actually a good recording level because you're leaving yourself some headroom in case the person gets much louder all of a sudden. However, that is not a good recording level for your final piece. You are going to have to do some post-processing. So I'm not sure if your expectation was that right out of the recorder it would be loud enough, because for me, I always purposely do it that way. Then in post is when I actually bring the level up to where I need it for the final piece. So that's one thing. If you are sending it to your camera from the recorder, and that was the part that was coming out low, and you were using this camera out line out here, you may have to adjust the little dial here. I don't know if you can see that here, but you need to check that as well and make sure that the levels on your camera are coming out to a good strong level. Not too hot so that you don't clip, but hot enough so that you'll get a good strong signal. So I think if I had to guess, Anna, I think your expectations were probably, and again, I don't know for sure. I wish we could talk right now, but I suspect that you were looking for something that was, would sound great right out of the recorder in terms of the overall loudness. The trick is when you're recording, you need to keep yourself plenty of headroom so that you don't clip. But that does mean in practical terms that if you want to get that nice, loud, present dialogue, you are going to have to do some post-processing as well. If you are enrolled in the course, I did have a post-processing session at the end of the course. You're welcome to go look at that. And if you have specific questions about it, I'm happy to address those in some future episodes as well. And I had a further question. I have another question. If I wanted to record on dual mono, what should I set the dual level to? Let's talk about dual mono for just a minute, because that's something I think that some people get confused about. Dual mono is what they call it on the Tascam recorders. What that does is you input one microphone and it actually records that input to two separate channels. In essence, it's actually taking over the second input as well with that one microphone that's just coming into the first input. And what it does is it records the second channel at a lower gain level. And the reason you would want to do that is that it gives you the assurance that if your talent does get really loud and the audio clips in the primary track, you have a recording of the exact same thing on the second track at a lower gain level. So it won't clip under most circumstances on the safety track or the second track. So What do you want to set the dual mono level to? Well, that depends. If I just go in here on the Tascam, you get the choice of going anywhere from 0 dB to minus 12 dB. The idea there is that you want it to be low enough to give you more headroom. So if you need 12 dB of headroom, and what I mean by that is if you think there's a chance that you're going to be recording something and the person could suddenly get 12 dB louder, you may want to record that safety track at minus 12 dB for the dual level setting. So that's how you do that on the Tascam. And again, this is something that I do sometimes. If you're doing an interview, and you're not going to get a lot of takes, it's a good idea to do this. If whatever you're recording, if you have 2 channels that you can use and you're only recording with 1 microphone, that's a great setting to use on the Tascam. The Zoom F8 has a similar thing. They call it something different. And I need to find it again. I think it's actually page 30. Oh yeah, they call it dual channel. I'm going to go ahead. Sorry, I wasn't sharing this. Let me share that again. They call it on the Zoom F8 dual channel rec, dual channel recording. The way this works is very similar. And this is actually another question that, who asked this one? Stephen Lovett asked this one. Hi, Curtis. Thanks for sharing your expertise. I'm a camera guy, not a sound guy, but I occasionally am required to do both. I strongly encourage production to hire a professional. Anyway, I'd like to record the boom to 2 channels on the F8 with different levels, but every combination of dual channel record or stereo links the levels. Any guidance would be appreciated. Yeah, it's a little bit different the way it works, Stephen, on the Zoom F8. Let me just show you here. You press the menu button, you select the rec menu, then you select dual channel rec. And if you turn it on for input 1, say you have the boom mic coming in on input 1, you turn that on. Then what happens is that channels 1 and 5 now become your dual channels. So they get linked automatically. Then all you have to do is for the channel 1, set your gain on the trim potentiometer right here, and then do the same thing for track 5 at a lower trim level. And that means that track 5 will actually be recording the same exact input from the boom microphone, but it will be recording it at a lower level. And that works very, very nicely. The nice thing on the Zoom is you have a little bit more flexibility. You can go much lower if you need to. So I hope that makes sense, Steve. That's how it works on the Zoom F8. Again, it's a little bit different than on the Tascam. So those are both good questions. So let me just get back here to Anna's question. Got so many windows. I got to find the right one. Here we are. Okay. There we go. All right. So that's the answer, Anna, also to your dual channel. That's only, again, if you need to kind of protect yourself and get a little more headroom in there and you're only using 1 channel on the Tascam DR60D Mark II. And Anna's final question for the week. If you want to record 2 mics, say an NTG4 and a wireless lavalier on your Tascam recorder, one on channel 1 and the other on channel 2 while you're recording an interview, how do you set up your Tascam DR60D Mark II so that it records both? Okay, let's look at that here. So back into the menu to the rec mode. You would say on rec mode, you would set that to stereo. Your source would be set to channel 1/2, and MS mode or mid-side mode would be turned off. And that's all you'd have to do to set up your Tascam DR60D Mark II to record 2 separate microphones. And that'll give you a stereo file with the boom mic. Say, for example, you have the boom on channel 1. That'll be on the left channel in your stereo track, and the lavalier will be on your right channel. So when you get into post, you can split those up and edit them separately and take it from there. So another good question. Thank you for that. Okay, a question here from IGIS Productions. Hi, Curtis. What's the main difference between adjusting sound amplitude with fader or gain controls from a Zoom F8 mixer recorder? I've noticed that the fader adjustments are not recorded. Apparently, adjustments are only modified when monitored through headphones. Is that a normal behavior or different settings should be made? Thanks so much. Okay, so now we're going back again to this concept we talked about at the start, and I know we're out of time here, but I'm going to go a little longer if that's okay with everybody. If not, totally understand. Thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you again in the future here before too long. But remember at the start, we talked a little bit about whether or not you needed a stereo mix track or just ISO tracks. The faders only affect the stereo mix track and what you're hearing in your headphones if you're monitoring the stereo mix track. So that's a very good question. So if you are recording both the stereo mix track and the ISO tracks as you're mixing on your Zoom F8, and on the, by the way, if you have a Zoom F8 and you're interested in doing some mixing, make sure that you get the new firmware. There's a version 2.0 of the firmware, and the version 2.0 gives you a lot of additional options that are going to make mixing on the actual device easier. The first thing is that when you are at your recorder, you have this the main encoder, the main dial that you use to select options, allows you to choose trim, fader, or pan. And what that does is that changes what each of the individual channel potentiometers change. By potentiometer, just to review, that's a dial in layman's terms. So if you want to adjust the fader level, which only affects the stereo mix track, what you'll want to do is change it to fader, and then moving the potentiometer changes the fader level for that channel. In other words, if you turn it left, it brings it down. If you turn it right, it brings it up in terms of amplitude. And yes, that will actually be recorded to the stereo mix track if you are recording one. Otherwise, with the default settings, it will just change what you're hearing in your headphones. So that's the important thing. The idea here is that when you record ISO tracks or isolated tracks, typically you just set the gain up at the start and then you don't change it at all throughout the rest of the piece. When you are doing live mixing, what you are changing is you're changing the levels of each of the microphone inputs for what gets recorded to the stereo mix track. So I hope that distinction makes sense there. And that's what is happening there when you are using the faders on your Zoom F8. Now, on other recorder mixers, like I recently purchased the Sound Devices 633, which is a mixer and recorder. You don't have to switch. You have a separate control for a fader from the gain trims, which is really nice. Makes it much easier to actually mix while you're recording. So that's kind of one of the big advantages of using one of those higher end devices. All right, we're still not done with questions. We have some more to go here. Stephen, we got yours. Let's see here. Rhett Brown at RetroRec says, I own a Roland R26 recorder. I'm not finding any reference to gain. They refer to a level. Is this an interchangeable term? That's a good question, Rhett. And yeah, on the higher end recorders, you're usually going to have a separate control for gain, sometimes called gain trim, sometimes called input. And then you have a separate control for a fader, or sometimes called output level. So there are lots of different terms that are used for different things, for the same things, I should say. But yeah, on the Roland R26, when they refer to level, technically, yeah, just use it interchangeably for our purposes for gain. It's the same idea. So yes, good question there as well. All right. Let me just check really quickly here and see if anyone has, excuse me. Oh, we do have a couple of questions here. Let me just make my window a little bigger so I can see it here. Okay. And I'm going to look at the Q&A panel to see if we have any questions there. It does not look like we do. Okay. I think we're set for this time. This is, I know there's a lot here. We covered some things there. I hope those settings are going to be helpful for you. Now, another kind of high-level principle to remember. Once you get those things set up, your sample rate, 48 kilohertz, or if you're going straight to YouTube, 44.1 kilohertz, your bit rate to 24-bit, your file format, recording format to WAV or broadcast wave. It's going to be WAV or BWF. Those are good settings to use. Then you set your gain, And in the Tascam, that's a setting in the menu. On the Zoom, it's a potentiometer. It's the little dial you can turn. Um, then on the Tascam, you can actually turn this little potentiometer here to fine tune the gain. And that's a little bit different than on the Zoom. Again, on the Zoom, you just have a single potentiometer that controls the gain level. Once you've done that, you're on your way. Now, these are all settings, and they're settings for a reason. They need to sometimes change. They're not the same thing for every situation. So sometimes I'll get a question from someone who's starting out, and I'm not trying to be critical here. This is the same kind of questions I asked at one point myself. What are the best settings I should be using? Well, the best settings are going to differ from situation to situation, from person to person who's being recorded. So the gain level is not always going to be the same for different talent. You're going to have to pull back for some people because they're a lot louder. You have to turn it up for other people because they're a little bit more soft spoken. But in terms of the setup ones that we talked about before, again, sample rate, bit depth, and record format to wave, broadcast wave, those pretty much I always keep the same. And it's just the gain level that I change when I need to adjust to different people. So, one other tip that I think we talked about in the course, but I don't think we talked about here today, as you're setting your gain level, you need to have your talent talking so that you can get a level. And there are various techniques. What I find works best in most cases, if you just start talking to them, they're going to talk in a quieter voice than they might necessarily talk when they get on camera. There's just something psychological when people get on camera, their voice, and they know they're being recorded, their voice changes. So, what I really recommend is that you either do a rehearsal run where you actually start recording on the camera and the audio recorder to get a level on them, because that way they're more likely to actually talk at the level they're going to be recorded at when you do the final piece or the official recording. And it's just sort of a psychological trick to get them at the levels you actually want them at, because that's what they're really going to be talking at. In the past, what I started off doing was just asking people, various questions, just if I didn't know them, just very, very innocuous, simple questions. Hey, how are you doing today? Try and engage them a little bit, get them involved. Ask if you have had to resort to questions like what'd you have for breakfast or lunch, or whatever the case may be. They worked in that context. The problem is that they talked in a conversational tone as opposed to the tone that they end up using when they're being recorded, which may be different. It may not. Some people that works okay on, but some people just don't respond well that way. And you really need to make them think like they're being recorded, think that they're being recorded, um, to get them to talk at the right level. So there are some things to cover today. I hope that was helpful for you. Go ahead and leave any questions you have over at the Google Plus site, or if you're enrolled in the class, you're welcome to email me anytime. Love to talk with you about any specific challenges that you're up against. And thanks for joining. We'll talk to you again next week. Take care, everybody.